If you can't join him, beat him. Today, President Obama unveiled his 2015 budget proposal in a nod to his fellow Democrats and the reality of a Republican-controlled House unwilling to cooperate on absolutely anything during an election year, and for that matter, any year. The proposal does away with cuts to the social safety net in favor of relief for the Americans who need it the most.
Our budget is about choices. It's about our values. As a country, we've got to make a decision if we're going to protect tax breaks for the wealthiest Americans or if we're going to make smart investments necessary to create jobs and grow our economy and expand opportunity for every American.
Among the proposals, an end to the carried interest loophole, which allows hedge fund managers to be taxed at a very low rate, much lower than the income tax rate, spending $302 billion to repair the nation's roads and bridges, and closing the $4 billion worth of fossil fuels loopholes every year. The proposal also includes an idea with historically bipartisan support. It is a little known but highly effective tax rebate for the poor called the Earned Income Tax Credit. Just yesterday, in a 200-plus page report on the supposed failures of the war on poverty, the GOP's ideas man himself, House Budget Committee Chair Paul Ryan, wrote, research finds that the best anti-poverty programs encourage work. Programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit increase labor force participation. The president likes the Earned Income Tax Credit, and Paul Ryan likes the Earned Income Tax Credit. So how did Mr. Ryan respond to the president's overture one day later? Quote, "This budget isn't a serious document," he said in a statement this morning. "It is a campaign brochure. In divided government, we need leadership and collaboration, and in this budget, we have neither." Collaboration like working together to further the same policy? Apparently not. Congressman Ryan was not the only Republican to chime in. Speaker John Boehner called the president's proposal perhaps his most irresponsible budget yet. Speaking as the man who stood idly by while his party shut down the federal government and nearly crashed the U.S. economy not but 6 months ago, Speaker Boehner should indeed know a thing or two about responsibility. Joining me now is political editor and White House correspondent at the Huffington Post, Sam Stein, and editor-in-chief of the highly anticipated Project X at Vox Media, Ezra Klein. Ezra, is there any chance, and maybe a parallel universe, that Republicans support something they actually support that the president also happens to support, like the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit?
Yes, definitely in a parallel universe.
Okay, great. Done.
The EITC, I want to take a second on this. The EITC is a really important policy. What it does is it takes folks who aren't making much money and it boosts their income. And the reason it does that, and the reason Nixon expanded it and Reagan expanded it and George W. Bush liked it, the reason it has had such support is that it is a way of getting folks for whom the workforce is not that attractive because their skills or the job market won't give them much money. It gets them into the labor force and it gets them a sort of a toehold. What this does is it deals with a huge hole in the Earned Income Tax Credit. And I actually brought a graph to sort of show where it is. Right now, the Earned Income Tax Credit mainly helps adults with children. It's part of our sort of history of only helping what we think of as the deserving poor, people who have kids, and those kids certainly deserve help. What this does is it takes the folks who don't have children and it radically boosts the EITC for them. I think on the right of that chart, the full-time minimum wage worker, you see it going a 25-time increase. So it's 25 times higher for a full-time minimum wage worker under the president's proposal than it would be otherwise. So this is something, unless for some reason you don't think that childless workers should be brought into the workforce, this should be a very, very bipartisan proposal. And just one last thing on it, it also brings the age at which it can begin from 25 down to 21. So for young people who are having a real hard time getting a reasonable paying job in this economy, it's also a really important change to the law.
Sam, the vitriol that greeted the release of the president's budget outline both surprised me and then didn't surprise me at all. And Republicans have chosen to focus on the $56 billion in additional spending for education, education, welfare, defense. But that's paid for. I mean, that's offset. So the notion that somehow this is a wildly irresponsible budget, this has stuff that Republicans like. Republicans used to like infrastructure spending, but instead they have seized on this narrative that this is somehow reckless.
Well, first of all, no one told me that we were allowed to bring graphs, and I would have brought graphs too to look as smart as Ezra, but I didn't get any warning.
You know,
secondly,
you're allowed next time.
Oh, there might not be next time.
Whoa.
Second,
It's a final graph anybody
will
can
get
ever
you
bring.
nowhere.
I'm
They're going to
dropping the
get you
mic.
nowhere. Go
All
ahead.
right, thank you. So, secondly, I agree with your point. I think if we took a step back and we looked at the past 3 years, we would notice that we've had a fairly robust austerity regimen in place. We've cut a lot of money, in part due to the sequester, and it's led to lowering the deficit. If you put that in the context of what this budget proposal suggests, it's only a modest increase in spending. We're talking about $56 billion, like you mentioned, and split between defense and non-defense, and it's all paid for. So we're established that the budget agreed to by Patty Murray and Paul Ryan, those spending levels will stay in place, and you will use a few other tax hikes and cuts elsewhere to pay for $56 billion to relieve the rest of sequestration. This still doesn't help everyone out. For instance, we have a piece coming up that shows that the NIH will be funded under the president's proposal at $30.2 billion. That, in real term money, is equivalent to about the level that George W. Bush funded the NIH in 2002. So we're not making people whole. In fact, we're actually lagging pretty badly. But if you were to look at what the Republicans are saying, this is probably the most reckless amount of spending possible.
You know, Sam, on that note, the president said our budget is about choices, it's about values, and this is expected to go basically nowhere. It's an outline, it's a moral document in the most sort of clear fashion from the White House. At the same time, you know, the president puts this out there and it's greeted with vitriol and also sort of in the days coming, I think, crickets. I mean, Dave Camp announced a major piece of tax reform, which you could agree with or not, but his own party put the nails in that coffin and said it was going nowhere. Republicans no longer feel like they have to answer policy with any other kind of policy.
Well, listen, I mean, on the one hand, that's true. On the other hand, you can look at the Senate Democrats who are not going to be putting forth a budget, in part because Patty Murray and Paul Ryan have established the parameters. I think the biggest question now going forward is what the House Republicans do with their document. They've been spending the past couple of weeks railing on the president's Health Care Act for cutting Medicare Advantage, but they themselves have used those cuts in their past budgets. I'm curious to see if they will do the same this go around. They also criticize the president for dropping chain CPI from his budget in this request, although he says it's still on the table. I'm curious if they are so committed to chain CPI, whether they will include it in their budget proposal this term, something they have not done. So both sides are clearly in attack mode, I would say, and part of it has to do with the fact that the elections are not too far away.
You know, Ezra, what do we expect? I mean, given what Paul Ryan said about the EITC on Monday and how he's roundly dismissed this budget on Tuesday, do you think there is consensus in the Republican Party and specifically in the House in terms of what should be proposed in a budget?
Not at all. Let me say there is some consensus in the House around what they can propose in a budget because they have been proposing fairly radical budgets and amazingly have gotten all their members to vote for a couple of years now. So I don't think you're going to see a complete fracturing, though, as always there will be tensions. What there is no consensus at all is how to propose governable policies that you could actually pass, possibly in a bipartisan way, possibly even in a partisan way if they were actually in power. One of, I think, the great questions in American politics is even if Paul Ryan became president in 2017 and had a Republican House and had a Republican Senate, would they pass anything that even looks at all like his budget with its tremendous cuts to long-term Medicare, with its tremendous cuts to Medicaid, to food stamps? It is very easy to have message documents when nobody's actually going to have to feel the pain of those policies. So I don't know if those budgets are real if they got back into power, and definitely we're not anywhere near a point where there's a common ground on things like the EITC or even, as you mentioned, Dave Camp's tax plan, which I think has some real problems to it, but was an overture to Democrats and was immediately cut off by Republicans. You know,
Sam, if we're talking about attack mode and kabuki theater, to borrow a phrase from David Axelrod, we're finding out, many verb tenses in one sentence, that the Democrats may go forward with a discharge petition to basically force Republican hands on immigration. And the expectation is that no Republicans are going to vote to actually take up the discharge petition, but that it will put Republicans in a very difficult place. How effective do you think that could be ahead of the 2014 midterms?
It's tough to say. I mean, obviously, it hurts more to be on the record, I would say, not supporting the immigration framework that the Senate passed, that the House is going to put in discharge petition. It certainly hurts a little bit more in the general election, but the midterms are a different beast. There are different turnout models. It's not as complicated as a national election. And it seems clear at this juncture that at least House Republicans have calculated that there's not that much of a political price to pay for not acting on immigration reform. I guess I was wrong when I suspected that it would have happened before 2014, but it increasingly looks unlikely. I think the National Party members are worried about its implications for 2016. But again, I just don't see the House Republicans shaking over this.
Ezra, real quick before we let you go, we talk a lot about the dearth of actual ideas or actual legislation that can be passed and used in governance. I can't read or talk today, apparently. And on some level, you think the Republicans would suffer at the polls nationally for their sort of, I think, policy ineptitude, which is being euphemistic. But then you look at the polling. In states with Senate races, this is according to Washington Post and ABC, 50% favor Republicans, 42% favor Democrats. That is despite the fact that when you ask people, who do you trust to do a better job helping the middle class, 47% of respondents say Democrats, only 34% say Republicans. The same with handling health care. 44% trust Democrats, 36% trust Republicans. So on those issues, sort of middle class economic policy and health care, the public trusts Democrats more, and yet they're still voting Republicans into office.
The great insight of the Republican Party, going back to Newt Gingrich in 1994, is voters blame the party in power if they don't like how things are going. If Washington isn't working, they believe it is a president's job to make it work. And so if the minority party can actively make it not work, that ultimately benefits the minority party, at least in the short term. I think Republicans have done a real job destroying their long-term brand, but in short-term, midterm cycles, making people very unhappy with Washington has not been a bad strategy for them.
Making Sam Stein very unhappy because he couldn't bring a chart was not my strategy
and I
today.
had so many charts to bring, too.
I aim to ameliorate that in the next time Sam graces us with his presence, if we can get him back on this show. Sam Stein and Ezra Klein, thank you both for your time.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
After the break, hours ago, Chris Christie held another town hall, but instead of facing tough questions about Bridgegate, the New Jersey governor called for a repeal of Obamacare. Does that sound familiar? It's coming up next. But first, we are just getting live shots of Secretary of State John Kerry arriving in Paris. That is after meeting with leaders in Ukraine earlier today. We'll have more coming up.